Producer cooperatives and credit unions proved to be a saving grace during the Depression in rural Nova Scotia. They did not make everyone in rural Nova Scotia instantly rich, but they did help to stabilize Nova Scotia's economy by extending loans to those most in need and allowing fishermen and farmers to capture a greater share of the profit from the sale of their products. It's very fair to say that the Great Depression in Nova Scotia was a bit less harsh because of the activities of the Antigonish Movement. Hi, and welcome to episode 13 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast series. I'm your host, Dave McGrain, a professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, and a member of the Perspectives Journal editorial committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy. I explore the impact that social democracy has had on Canadian history and give you some tips for your own activism today. In the last episode, I looked at the life and times of George Harrar Williams, who is one of the architects of the Saskatchewan CCF's historic victory in 1944. In this episode, I will go all the way across the country to take a look at a pioneer social democracy in Atlantic Canada. If you look at the political science books written about Atlantic Canada, you will notice that they always talk about how this region has a very conservative political culture. What these books miss, however, is that there is a social democratic political tradition in Atlantic Canada, particularly in Nova Scotia. And one of the founders of that social democratic political tradition is Moses Coady. Moses Coady was a Nova Scotian through and through. He was born in the Magray Valley in Cape Breton in 1882. He grew up on a modest farm as the eldest son of a large Catholic family of 12 children. Being the oldest, he had a large amount of responsibilities on the farm. In fact, later on in his life, he described his early education as somewhat spotty due to farm chores and a crowded home. In his teenage years, he noticed the large-scale outmigration from Magray Valley because the farms and small fishing operations were not profitable. He couldn't help but wonder why, and wonder what he could do to change this. His first thought was that education might be the answer. If Nova Scotians were better educated, they might be able to find solutions to the problems that they were facing. So he attended Teachers College and got his teaching certificate in 1900. He was then the principal of Magray Forks High School from 1901 to 1903 before heading off to get his bachelor's from St. Francis Xavier University in 1905. Like the locals, I'll shorten St. Francis Xavier University to St. FX for this podcast. Coming out of St. FX, Coady was restless, like there was something missing in his life, but he didn't know what it was. He felt pessimistic, unsatisfied, and unhappy all at the same time. It was at this moment that he would receive a visit that would change his whole life. His cousin, Jimmy Hopkins, came over to see him. Coady had always admired Hopkins. Hopkins was a Catholic priest who attended a prestigious theological college in Rome. When he returned back to Nova Scotia, Hopkins was appointed as a professor at St. FX. Hopkins convinced Coady that answering God's call to become a priest was the way that he could fill that emptiness that he felt inside. As a priest, Coady could follow the example of Jesus and tend to the poor in Nova Scotia. Coady followed his cousin's advice and applied to take training to become a Catholic priest. The local bishop was very impressed with Coady and his academic abilities. In fact, Coady was sent to the same prestigious theological college in Rome that his cousin had attended. In Rome, Coady obtained a PhD in theology and was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1910. While Coady was happy studying in Rome, he longed to return home to Nova Scotia. He felt himself being drawn back, like a tide returning to its shore. He returned home and spent about a decade teaching at his alma mater, St. FX. I know that the 1920s are generally considered to be an era of economic prosperity in Canada, but that was not true in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, the economy was starting to nosedive at the beginning of the 1920s and times were tough. While Coady had never lost his concern for the poor, He had become a bit isolated at university, and he was beginning to notice the party around him more and more. He began to remember the whole reason that he got into the priesthood in the first place. That was to help the less fortunate. And all of a sudden, something ignited inside of him, like a long-dormant flame catching light again. In 1921, he was approached by the Provincial Educational Association, which was a new union of elementary and high school teachers in Nova Scotia. They described the difficult situation of teachers to him. Teachers were paid barely enough to survive and had no job security. In fact, 4 out of 5 teachers were young women who lost their jobs as soon as they were married. Coady dedicated himself to their cause. He had finally stepped out of the ivory tower of the university and had become involved in real-world politics. He felt invigorated and alive, like he had stepped into his true calling. He spent much of the next 3 years expanding the membership of the union and editing the Nova Scotia Teachers Bulletin. In 1924, 1/2 of Nova Scotia teachers were paid members of the union, and their salaries and benefits had started to improve. Coady was happy with his success, but he felt that there was much more to be done. By the time that Coady resigned from the union in 1924, regional economic conditions had worsened. There was a series of bitter strikes in the Cape Breton coal mines that were violently repressed when the federal government sent in the Canadian Army. And there was a continuing out-migration from Nova Scotia's farms and fishing communities caused by the province's economic decline. All of this profoundly affected Catholics in Nova Scotia. And socially minded priests like Coady began searching for ways to counteract these problems. His work in union organizing had got Coady interested in politics, and he thought that maybe politics could help out. But he was a Catholic priest, and it was forbidden by the Pope for him to run for a political office or even join a political party. He had to find another way. Like Paul on the road to Damascus, an epiphany occurred to him in the form of 2 words: adult education. He later stated that the short, quick, scientific way to progress the world was through enlightenment and education of adults. What he envisioned was a network of study clubs across Nova Scotia where average people would educate themselves on what could be done to solve the economic problems of their community. Coady ended up having the right idea at the right time. Parish priests, the Scottish Catholic Society of Canada, and the St. FX Alumni Association all wanted the university to do something to solve the economic problems of rural Nova Scotia. Media attention was also being drawn to fishermen facing prices so low that they actually lost money by going out fishing. All this pressure led the federal government to launch a royal commission to investigate the crisis in Nova Scotia's fishing industry. It was the opportunity that Coady had been waiting for. He testified at the commission's Halifax hearing in November 1927. He argued that rural economies could be revitalized if the right type of learning was cultivated in ordinary people, especially critical thinking, scientific methods of planning and production, and the use of cooperative ownership. So he said the government had to step up and immediately fund adult education. In conservative Nova Scotia in the 1920s, Coady's idea was bold. The thinking in Nova Scotia had always been very individualistic. Everyone should take care of themselves. And Nova Scotians had always thought that the government should stay out of the economy and let the free market dictate what happens. All of a sudden, this Catholic priest was telling them that they needed to cooperate with each other and that the government needed to directly intervene in the economy. The final report of the commission largely endorsed Coady's ideas, and lots of things started to happen all at once. It was like a dam breaking and water rushing through. The Federal Department of Fisheries asked Coady to help the government to organize the fishermen. Coady organized for 10 months and then convened the United Maritime Fishermen's Organization at a convention in Halifax on June 24th and 25th in 1930. Its main aim was to help local fishermen set up fish processing plants, supply stores, and marketing systems as cooperatively owned companies. At the same time, the Board of Governors of St. FX organized an extension department to carry out adult education in rural Nova Scotia. Coady was appointed as its first director. The United Maritime Fishermen and the Extension Department of St. FX combined to build the foundation of what became known as the Antigonish Movement. The motivation behind the Antigonish Movement was simple. It wanted to wake up rural Nova Scotians. The staff of the Extension Department at St. FX used local Catholic parish networks to call mass meetings of parishioners. Now, in most of these Nova Scotian towns, almost everyone was Catholic. So when a special meeting was called by the Catholic Church, everybody showed up. Coady often spoke at these meetings and frequently lectured the community about the problems of rural Nova Scotia and the need for collective solutions to these problems. He would end his speech by asking the audience two questions. What do we need and how can we get it? At this meeting, the idea of a study club was floated, and the study club was usually founded. Then, using materials provided by St. FX's Extension Department, the club began to study the economic problems of their own community. The mantra of the clubs was always listen, study, discuss, act. Usually, the study club would come up with the same conclusion. Average people must take their destiny in their own hands by creating cooperatives and credit unions that could ensure the economic prosperity of their community. With economic conditions getting worse and worse in Nova Scotia as the Great Depression hit, these study clubs sprang up all over the province. The sheer number of clubs organized was impressive. Between 1932 and 1938, study clubs increased in number from 179 to 650. Membership in these clubs grew from 1,500 to 10,650. For such a small province, these numbers proved the Antigonish Movement to be an amazing success. That urge that Coady had felt so many years ago to help the less fortunate in Nova Scotia had finally translated into something very real and concrete. It was like the architectural plans that he had drawn up long ago had been turned into a building. For the most part, the study clubs ended up either setting up a credit union or cooperative of producers in their local community. The motivation for a credit union was always the same. The problem was that private banks were solely concerned with their profit margins. Some things don't change. In a place like rural Nova Scotia, this meant sky-high mortgage rates and high banking fees for individual customers. Private banks also refused to give loans to rural small businesses and small farming and fishing operations. This meant that these small producers and small businesses did not have the capital to expand their operations and make themselves more efficient. The study clubs of the Antigonish Movement realized that they could solve these problems by pooling all local savings into a credit union that was owned and operated by its consumers. This credit union was a democratic institution that operated on the basis of one member, one vote. And credit unions were not looking to maximize their profits to be sent to shareholders in central Canada. Credit unions basically ran on a break-even basis and were able to provide loans to both customers and small businesses at very reasonable rates. All the money stayed in the local community and none of it was sent away to enrich businessmen in Toronto, Montreal. At the same time, studies clubs of the Antigonish Movement set up producive cooperatives in the fishing, dairy, fruit, and livestock sectors. The idea behind these producer cooperatives was simple. They were owned and operated by producers and democratically ran on a basis of one producer, one vote. Before these cooperatives existed, producers had to sell to private wholesalers who then sold their produce to a store who then sold it to customers. Cooperatives acted to get rid of the middleman who's always taking a slice of the profit for himself. The producer cooperative can either sell its produce directly to stores or set up its own retail outlet and sell directly to consumers. The whole point is that the number of businessmen taking a slice of the profit was reduced. And that left more profit for the person who actually produced the food. That is the fisherman or the farmer themselves. Both producer cooperatives and the credit unions proved to be a saving grace during the Depression in rural Nova Scotia. They did not make everyone in rural Nova Scotia instantly rich, but they did help to stabilize Nova Scotia's economy by extending loans to those most in need and allowing fishermen and farmers to capture a greater share of the profit from the sale of their products. It's very fair to say that the Great Depression in Nova Scotia was a bit less harsh because of the activities of the Antigonish Movement. At the end of the 1930s, the Antigonish Movement was at the height of its influence. Coady himself was gaining both national and international prominence. He traveled beyond Nova Scotia to Ontario, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, where his speeches and ideas helped establish local credit unions and cooperatives. He was even featured on a CBC program about cooperatives. And increasing numbers of people from all over the world who were interested in the co-op movement were coming to St. FX to learn from Coady. In particular, there were Catholic clergy from developing countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia who came to visit Coady at St. FX. In 1939, Coady published Masters of Their Own Destiny, which summed up his political philosophy and described the successes of the Antigonish Movement. It is considered a classic in the cooperative movement, has been translated into 7 different languages. Coady uses Masters of Their Own Destiny to condemn the terrible exploitation of Nova Scotia's farmers, fishermen, and workers by large monopolies whose owners do not seem to care about others in society and only think of themselves. He says that all of the money that these businessmen make can buy them luxuries while they're on earth, but it will never save their soul and secure them a place with God in heaven. Coady argues that cooperatives are important because they ensure that the common Nova Scotian guides the priorities of the economy. Through the democratic structure of cooperatives, average people can come to own and control a sizable part of the Nova Scotia economy. But where does the emphasis on adult education come in? Masters of Their Own Destiny contends that Nova Scotians are not the victims of economic and political forces over which they have no control. Adult education programs in the farming and fishing communities of Nova Scotia can lead citizens towards breaking with old ways of thinking and having the self-confidence to embrace new ideas that will give them greater control over the direction of their lives. There's definitely an element of self-help in Coady's ideas. That is, people coming together to help themselves. In fact, Coady wrote that common people must take the steps or expanded effort necessary to change society. If they do not bestir themselves to bring it about, no one else will. Unfortunately, the Antigonish movement went into decline in the 1940s as Nova Scotians focused on World War I and the war effort. In 1952, Coady suffered a heart attack and retired as the director of the St. FX Extension Department. In his dying days, Coady told his bishop that he was at peace with God. He said that, "If I die happy in the thought that my blueprint is being realized much more surely than I'd ever had the right to expect." He passed away in 1959. At his funeral, 2 fishermen, 2 farmers, a miner, and a steelworker carried his body to a grave overlooking Antigonish. Coady had a major impact on Canadian history. The model of the Antigonish movement definitely softened the impact of the Great Depression for many Nova Scotians. More importantly, it is a model that has been exported around the world. Even today, you can find microfinancing projects in Africa and South America that explicitly take inspiration from Coady's ideas. Coady also helped found a social democratic tradition in Atlantic Canada. Even though he was never part of a political party, his ideas of collectivism and cooperation challenged the conservatism of Atlantic Canada's political culture. In many ways, he helped lay the foundation for the success of the NDP in Nova Scotia in the latter part of the 20th century and all the way up until today. If there's a lesson that Coady gives us, it is that empowering ordinary people is a neglected part of social democracy. Too often, social democrats want to build up big government programs to do things for people, especially for vulnerable people. Now, there's nothing wrong with these types of programs, but it's also crucial that social democrats focus on ways to empower people to help themselves. That is, give them the tools to improve their own lives. We don't have to be cruel and say that everyone should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. That's too individualistic. But social democrats should not shy away from thinking about ways to encourage small-scale cooperation in our local communities. As Coady's life and ideas showed, this can be a powerful way to bring greater social and economic justice into our world. I'm Dave McGrain, and thanks for joining me on Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal podcast series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or leave a review on the Perspectives Journal podcast on all major podcast platforms, and share it with somebody you know who loves Canadian political history. And subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into news stories that you won't find in the major newspapers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more about social democracy in the Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. And for more information on the Broadbent Institute's work, subscribe to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe. Next time, we will talk about a politician who built the CCF into a national political force under very difficult and trying circumstances. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.